A desperate young mother with no memory clutches her dying baby on Seattle's rainy streets, carrying only a mysterious can of formula with a faded photograph. The one clue to her identity is a distinctive scar, identical to one belonging to billionaire Edward Monroe's deceased wife. For 25 years, Edward has been haunted by his young son's disappearance, pouring millions into finding missing children while his own grief calcified his heart. But when this nameless woman whispers, "I remember your smell," something inside him fractures. The baby's eyes mirror his missing son's exactly, a genetic impossibility that will unravel decades of carefully constructed lies. As Edward brings the pair to safety, buried secrets emerge from the shadows: a forbidden love affair, a stolen child, a mother's dangerous obsession, and a truth so devastating it could destroy them all. The answers lie hidden in a red piano, a music box, and the faded photograph on that formula can. Follow, like, and comment to let us know where you're watching from. This story will break your heart and rebuild it, but only if you stay until the shocking final revelation. The gray sky hung heavy over downtown Seattle, pressing down like a cold, wet blanket on the city below. Rain pattered against the sidewalk where a young woman stood shivering, her dirty hoodie providing little protection against the December chill. Her arms cradled a newborn baby, wrapped in what appeared to be a hotel towel, the infant's face pinched and reddened from the cold. The woman's eyes were hollow, haunted, the kind of emptiness that spoke of something broken inside. She didn't offer her name to the curious passers-by, not out of defiance, but because she simply didn't know it. Those who passed by saw only another homeless person, another tragedy to avoid eye contact with. "Ma'am, are you all right?" A woman in a navy pea coat approached cautiously, her ID badge identifying her as Carol Winters, a social worker from the downtown emergency shelter. "That baby needs to be inside. You both do." The young mother, if that's what she was, backed away, clutching the infant tighter. A thin, jagged scar ran along her jawline, visible when she turned her head. It wasn't surgical. It looked like the kind of mark left by someone who wanted to hurt, not heal. "I can't go in there," she whispered, her voice hoarse as though she hadn't used it in days. "He'll find us." Carol had heard similar fears before, had seen the desperation in too many women's eyes. "No one will find you at the shelter. We have security protocols." The young woman shook her head violently, causing the baby to whimper. Immediately, her focus shifted, her trembling hands trying to soothe the infant. With sudden urgency, she reached into her torn backpack and pulled out a dented can of baby formula. "Look," she said, thrusting it forward. "Look at this." Carol expected to see nothing special, just a standard can of formula, perhaps stolen from a grocery store. But taped to the side with yellowed, aging adhesive was a faded photograph. A smiling boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with bright eyes and a toothy grin. The picture was worn around the edges, as if someone had handled it constantly, rubbing their fingers along the borders until the image began to fade. "I need to find this man," the woman said, her voice barely audible above the traffic noise. "He'll know who I am." "This is just a child," Carol said gently. "This isn't a man." "He's grown now," the woman insisted, a desperate certainty in her voice. "I know it. He'll know me. He'll remember." The baby started coughing, a weak, rattling sound that made Carol's heart sink. That wasn't a healthy cough. "Your baby needs medical attention," Carol said firmly. "Let me help you both, and then we can look into finding this person." The woman's eyes darted around the street, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "Promise you won't call the police," she demanded. "Promise me." "I just want to help the baby," Carol assured her. 20 miles away, in a glass-walled penthouse office atop the Monroe Foundation Tower, Edward Monroe stared unseeing at the financial reports on his tablet. His reflection in the window showed a man in his 60s, once handsome, now hardened by grief and time. His silver hair was impeccably styled, his tailored suit worth more than what most people in the city below made in a month. 25 years ago, Edward Munro had been a different man. A loving father to his son Caleb, a devoted husband, a philanthropist who believed in making the world better. That was before Caleb disappeared without a trace at age 9, before his wife spiraled into depression and eventually took her own life. The Munro Foundation had been established with a single purpose: to find missing children and reunite them with their families. For years, Edward had poured millions into the search for his son, hiring private investigators, offering rewards, following every possible lead. But after 15 years with no answers, something inside him had calcified. The foundation continued its work, but Edward's personal involvement had diminished to signing checks and attending the occasional fundraiser. The foundation that once reflected his heart's deepest hope now felt like nothing more than a tax shelter, a public relations exercise to maintain the Munro name. Mr. Munro? His assistant Thomas appeared at the door, tablet in hand. Channel 7 wants a statement about the Foundation's 25th anniversary next month. Draft something appropriate, Edward said dismissively, not looking up from his own tablet. The usual: hope, perseverance, our continuing commitment, etc. Thomas hesitated. There's something else. A local interest story just broke about a woman with amnesia who turned up at downtown emergency with a baby. Apparently she's carrying a photo of a child and claiming she needs to find him. Social media is already connecting it to our foundation's work. Another opportunist, Edward grunted, tossing his tablet onto the desk. They come out of the woodwork every time we're in the news cycle. What does she want? Money, I assume. That's just it, sir. She hasn't asked for anything. She seems genuinely confused, and Thomas swiped to a news clip on his tablet and handed it to Edward. There's something about her that's getting attention. The video showed a brief interview with Carol Winters outside the shelter. In the background, partially visible through a window, was the young woman cradling her baby. The reporter was saying something about the mystery woman's condition, but Edward wasn't listening. He had frozen, finger hovering over the screen. He tapped to enlarge the image, focusing on the woman's face. The scar on her jaw, that distinctive, crooked mark. Impossible, he whispered. His wife, Margaret, had had an identical scar since childhood, the result of falling through a glass coffee table. It had been their private joke that it looked like a question mark, a symbol of her perpetually curious nature. Edward zoomed in further, looking at the baby bundled in the woman's arms. For just a moment, as the infant turned toward the camera, Edward could see the eyes, bright green eyes, Caleb's eyes. That night, for the first time in years, Edward Munro left his tower. He drove himself, dismissing his driver, taking a car that wouldn't be recognized. He parked a block from the shelter and walked through the rain, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles he didn't notice. The social worker recognized him immediately. Mr. Munro, this is unexpected. Where is she? His voice was cold, controlled, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Carol led him through the shelter to a small, private room where the woman sat on a cot, the baby asleep in a makeshift crib fashioned from a drawer. The woman looked up as the door opened, her eyes widening slightly before she looked away. "Who are you?" Edward asked, his tone frigid despite the inferno of questions burning inside him. The woman didn't answer immediately. She kept her gaze on the sleeping infant, running a gentle finger along the baby's cheek. "I've been asking myself that for months," she finally said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I don't know my name. I don't know where I'm from. I wake up screaming from nightmares I can't remember." She looked up at him then, and something in her eyes, defiant yet vulnerable, reminded Edward painfully of Margaret. "But I know one thing," she continued. "This baby is dying, and you're the last person who can help." As if on cue, the infant stirred, a weak cough bubbling from its tiny chest. Edward stood motionless, 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind. Was this an elaborate con? A cruel coincidence? Or something else entirely? The woman turned back to the baby, tenderly adjusting its blanket. Then, in a voice that suddenly sounded almost childlike, she added, "I remember your smell." Edward felt the ground shift beneath him, a vertigo that had nothing to do with the physical world. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls around his heart, built over 25 years of grief and disappointment, began to crack. And somewhere, in a part of his mind he had locked away long ago, a terrible suspicion began to form. Edward Munro stood motionless in the shelter's dim hallway, his fingers gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Behind the closed door, the woman with his dead wife's scar and the sickly infant with his missing son's eyes waited in uneasy silence. The call he was making would change everything, or confirm this was all an elaborate hoax designed to exploit his deepest wound. "Dr. Abernathy? It's Edward Munro. I need your discretion on a matter of extreme sensitivity." He spoke in hushed tones, each word measured carefully. "I need you to prepare the private wing at Lakeside Clinic. 2 patients. Complete confidentiality, no records outside your personal files." Dr. Abernathy had been the Munro family physician for 30 years. He was one of the few people who knew what Edward had endured after Caleb's disappearance. The breakdown, the pills, the night he'd nearly followed his wife into oblivion. "I'll handle it personally," the doctor promised. "When should I expect them?" 20 minutes. Edward ended the call and returned to the small room where Carol Winters was helping the young woman gather her meager belongings. "You're coming with me," Edward announced, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "The baby will receive proper medical care." The woman clutched the infant closer. "Where are you taking us?" A flash of fear crossed her face, that instinctive wariness of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust. "Somewhere safe," Edward replied, softer now. "Somewhere no one will find you." In the back of Edward's sleek black Bentley, the woman stared out at the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, her reflection ghostly in the tinted windows. The baby had fallen into a fitful sleep, its tiny chest rising and falling with worrying irregularity. "You recognized me," Edward said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. She turned to look at him, her hollow eyes somehow both vacant and piercing. "Not you. Your photo. On the formula can. That's not me in that photo." "I know." She closed her eyes briefly as if summoning strength. "It's the boy, the one who—" She trailed off, pressing her palm against her forehead in frustration. "The memories are like water. I can't hold them." Lakeside Clinic sat on the shores of Lake Washington, its modern architecture discreetly hidden behind old-growth trees, catering to Seattle's ultra-wealthy. Dr. Abernathy met them at a private entrance, his professional demeanor never slipping despite the strangeness of the situation. Within hours, the baby was in an incubator, attached to monitors that tracked his failing heart. The woman, after reluctantly allowing a nurse to take the infant, collapsed onto a hospital bed in the adjoining room, her exhaustion finally overwhelming her. "Initial assessment," Edward asked Dr. Abernathy as they observed the sleeping woman through a one-way glass. "Severe malnutrition, signs of past physical trauma. MRI shows evidence of a significant head injury, perhaps 6 to 8 months ago. That could explain the memory loss." The doctor hesitated. "Edward, the DNA tests will take time, but I must caution you." "I know what you're going to say," Edward cut him off. "That I'm seeing what I want to see. That grief can play tricks on the mind." "Not just that," Dr. Abernathy said gently. "The baby has a congenital heart condition. It's severe. He'll need surgery within days, perhaps hours." Edward's jaw tightened. "Do what's necessary. The procedures, the specialists, we're talking about $500,000 minimum. Money isn't the issue." Edward's voice hardened. "The issue is whether I'm being played for a fool." That night, Edward sat in a chair beside the woman's hospital bed, watching her restless sleep. She mumbled disconnected phrases. Piano red, Sammy, blue cage. Nothing that made sense, nothing that could lead him to answers. A soft knock at the door announced a young nurse. "Mr. Monroe, the baby's awake. He's not doing well." In the NICU, the infant lay surrounded by machines that seemed obscenely large next to his tiny form. His skin had a bluish tint that Dr. Abernathy had explained was due to poor oxygenation from his heart defect. Edward stood rigidly by the incubator, unwilling to touch the child, unwilling to allow himself to feel anything yet. This could all be coincidence. The scar could be a cruel trick of nature. The green eyes could be a genetic fluke. Then the baby's eyes fluttered open, focusing with surprising clarity on Edward's face. A small hand emerged from the swaddling, fingers splayed as if reaching out. Without thinking, Edward extended his index finger. The tiny hand closed around it with startling strength. Something cracked inside Edward's chest, a fissure in the wall of ice he'd built around his heart over a quarter-century of grief. The baby's grasp felt like an accusation, a plea, a connection he couldn't deny. "He's a Monroe," Edward whispered to himself, the words both a revelation and a surrender. "I know it." Back in her room, the woman had awakened, her eyes clearer than before. A hospital meal sat untouched on her tray table. "You need to eat," Edward said from the doorway. "The baby—" "Holding on." Edward sat heavily in the chair beside her. "The doctors are preparing for surgery." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she already knew. "He's special, important." "Why do you say that?" "Because they wanted him dead." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "That's the only memory that never fades. Someone wanted both of us gone." Edward leaned forward. Who? Who wanted you gone?" She shook her head, frustration evident in the furrow of her brow. "I don't remember faces. Just feelings. Fear. Always fear." A nurse entered with medication for the woman, interrupting their conversation. As she was arranging the pills, she noticed something half buried in the backpack that sat open on the floor. "What's this?" she asked, reaching down to extract a thin plastic bracelet, the kind used for hospital identification. The woman's eyes widened. "I don't know. I've never seen that before." The nurse handed it to Edward. It was a child's ID bracelet, the type used in pediatric wards. Where a name should have been printed, someone had viciously scratched out the text, gouging the plastic with such force that it had nearly torn the bracelet in two. Edward turned it over in his hands, a cold dread settling in his stomach. On the reverse side, barely visible under the fluorescent lights, was a date. No 6/17/1999, the day Caleb disappeared. Morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds of the Lakeside Clinic's private suite, casting thin, golden bars across the sterile floor. Outside the window, Lake Washington shimmered like polished silver under the rare February sunshine. It had been 3 days since Edward Monroe had brought the mysterious woman and her critically ill infant to the clinic, and still the DNA results hadn't arrived. The baby's surgery was scheduled for tomorrow. Dr. Abernathy had assembled a team of the nation's top pediatric cardiac surgeons, flown in on Edward's private jet. The infant's condition, a complex combination of ventricular septal defect and pulmonary stenosis, required immediate intervention. Edward stood at the window, his reflection ghost-like against the bright outdoor scene. He hadn't left the clinic since their arrival, sleeping instead in a reclining chair in the corner of the woman's room, as if afraid she might vanish if he looked away. The scratched hospital bracelet from her backpack now lay in the breast pocket of his shirt, a constant reminder of what was at stake. "Mr. Monroe?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Your assistant is here with the items you requested." Thomas entered, carrying a small leather suitcase. His eyes darted curiously toward the woman, who sat in a chair by her bed, slowly spooning applesauce into her mouth. The proper nutrition and hydration had already made a noticeable difference in her appearance. Her hollow cheeks had filled slightly, and the dark circles beneath her eyes had begun to fade. "Everything you asked for," Thomas said, handing over the suitcase. "And Mrs. Winters is waiting in the lobby as requested." Edward nodded. Send her up in 10 minutes. And Thomas, not a word to anyone." "Of course, sir." After Thomas left, Edward placed the suitcase on the bed and opened it. Inside were clothes for the woman, simple but high-quality items in approximately her size, along with toiletries, a hairbrush, and a few books. "I thought you might like some fresh things," Edward said, his voice gruff with unspoken emotions. He still hadn't decided whether to trust her, but he couldn't bear to see her in the same tattered clothing day after day. She touched the soft fabric of a cream-colored sweater, her fingers tracing the weave as if it was something precious and unfamiliar. "Thank you," she murmured. Edward took a deep breath. "I've asked Mrs. Winters, the social worker who found you, to bring someone here, someone who might recognize you." Her head snapped up, eyes suddenly alert with fear. "Who?" "Someone I trust. Someone who's been with my family for a very long time." The woman's hands began to tremble. "The baby is safe," Edward assured her. "No one can reach him in the NICU. This is just a test." Her jaw tightened, the scar along it becoming more pronounced. "You still think I'm lying?" Edward met her gaze steadily. "I think there are too many coincidences. I think you might be the key to something I've been searching for half my life, but I need to be sure." 10 minutes later, Mrs. Winters arrived with an elderly woman in tow. Martha Campbell had been the Monroe family's housekeeper for over 40 years. She had bounced Caleb on her knee as an infant, had comforted Edward through the darkest days after the disappearance, had been the one to find Margaret's body after her suicide. If anyone would recognize a connection to the Monroe family, it would be Martha. The old woman entered the room with trepidation, her eyes immediately fixing on Edward with concern. "Mr. Eddy, you look terrible. Have you been sleeping at all?" Despite everything, Edward smiled faintly at the familiar chiding. Only Martha still called him Eddy, a remnant from his childhood that had survived all these years. "I'm fine, Martha. Thank you for coming." Martha sniffed disapprovingly, then turned her attention to the woman who had risen from her chair and stood awkwardly by the bed, clutching the new sweater to her chest like a shield. Their eyes met. Martha's face drained of all color. Her hand flew to her heart, and she stumbled backward, her knees buckling beneath her. Edward lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground, easing her gently into a chair as Mrs. Winters rushed to get water. "Martha, what is it? Do you recognize her?" Edward demanded, kneeling before the elderly woman whose breathing had become rapid and shallow. Martha's eyes never left the young woman's face. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. She looks just like Rose." The name hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Edward felt the room tilt around him, his vision narrowing to a pinpoint. "Rose," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Rose Wilson." Martha nodded, tears welling in her rheumy eyes. The same eyes, the same way she holds herself. It's uncanny. Edward turned slowly to face the woman, who stood frozen, her expression a mixture of confusion and mounting distress. "Who is Rose?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Edward couldn't answer. The implications were too staggering, too horrible to voice aloud. Rose Wilson had been Margaret's best friend since childhood. They had been inseparable until Rose vanished without a trace, just 2 weeks before Caleb was taken. The official story had been that Rose moved suddenly to Australia after a bitter argument with Margaret. No one had questioned it at the time. Everyone had been too preoccupied with Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior, her paranoia, her obsessive fear that someone was watching the house, following her, threatening Caleb. And then Caleb was gone, and nothing else had mattered. "Sit down," Edward finally said to the woman, his voice thick with emotion. "Please." She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands now gripping the sweater so tightly her knuckles had whitened. Something was happening behind her eyes, a faint flicker of recognition perhaps, or the first stirrings of a buried memory fighting its way to the surface. She began, then winced, pressing her palm against her temple. "I see a room, dark curtains, heavy perfume." She closed her eyes, her face contorted with effort. Someone is brushing my hair, hard, too hard, pulling. Martha gasped softly, one gnarled hand covering her mouth. What else? Edward urged, moving closer. What else do you remember? The woman's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling rapidly. A voice saying, "You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere." Her eyes flew open, wild with sudden panic. I can't breathe. I can't. Dr. Abernathy appeared in the doorway, alerted by the monitors that had begun to beep in warning. Her heart rate is spiking. Everyone needs to step back. As a nurse hurried in with a sedative, Edward reluctantly backed away, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just witnessed. Martha sat trembling in her chair, looking as though she had seen a ghost. That night, after Martha and Mrs. Winters had gone and the woman slept peacefully under sedation, Edward sat alone in the hospital corridor, staring at his phone. On the screen was an old photograph, one of the few he had kept from those days. It showed Margaret and Rose at a garden party, their arms linked, smiling into the camera. Margaret, elegant and poised as always, and Rose, with her wild copper hair and mischievous smile. The resemblance was unmistakable. The woman sleeping in that hospital room could easily be Rose's daughter, but that would mean... Edward's hands began to shake. He couldn't finish the thought. It was too devastating, too earth-shattering to contemplate. If this woman was Rose's daughter, and if the baby truly was a Monroe by blood, as the preliminary tests suggested, then everything Edward had believed for 25 years was a lie. In the darkness of her hospital room, the woman's dreams were vivid and terrifying. She saw an armoire door slowly creaking open, heard the metallic clatter of something falling to the floor, a can of baby formula, its contents spilling like blood across polished hardwood. The operating theater at Lakeside Clinic hummed with the quiet intensity of high-stakes medicine. 6 medical professionals moved in choreographed precision around the impossibly small body on the table. The baby, still without a name, lay unconscious, his tiny chest exposed under the harsh surgical lights. Dr. Catherine Chen, the pediatric cardiac surgeon Edward had flown in from Johns Hopkins, bent over the infant with unwavering concentration, her gloved hands steady as they navigated the complex geography of a heart barely the size of a walnut. In the observation room above, Edward stood motionless at the glass, his reflection a ghostly overlay on the scene below. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since bringing the woman and child to the clinic 5 days ago. The DNA results had finally arrived that morning. The baby shared genetic markers consistent with the Monroe bloodline. Not a definitive match to Caleb. They would need Caleb's DNA for that, and all they had were the samples preserved from his childhood medical records, but close enough to suggest a familial relationship. It's going well, Dr. Abernathy said softly, joining Edward at the window. Dr. Chen is the best there is for this procedure. Edward nodded without taking his eyes off the surgery. And the woman? Resting. The sedatives have helped with her anxiety, but the memory fragments are still causing significant distress. Dr. Abernathy paused. Edward, I received an unusual call from a Dr. Patel at Seattle Memorial. He claims someone offered him $50,000 for information about your guests. Edward's head snapped toward Abernathy, his eyes narrowing. Who? He didn't get a name. The call came through an untraceable number. Dr. Patel declined, of course, and reported it immediately, but we have a leak, Edward finished, his voice hardening. Someone knows they're here. Down in the operating theater, a monitor beeped insistently. Dr. Chen called for additional blood, her voice calm but urgent. The baby's heart rate had begun to fluctuate dangerously. Edward pressed his palms against the glass, as if he could somehow will his own strength into the failing infant. For the first time in decades, he found himself praying, not to any specific deity, but to whatever forces might be listening. Don't give up, he whispered. Fight. As if in response, the monitors stabilized. The surgical team's tension visibly eased, and Dr. Chen proceeded with the delicate repair of the ventricular septal defect, the hole in the heart that had been slowly killing the child. 2 floors below, in her private room, the woman who might be Rose Wilson's daughter lay in restless sleep. Her dreams were fragments of memory, shards of a broken mirror that reflected distorted pieces of her past. A piano with chipped red paint, a blue birdcage hanging empty in a sun-drenched room, hands pulling her hair so hard that tears sprang to her eyes. And always, always, the sense that she was running from something or someone who would never stop looking for her. She woke with a start to find Martha Campbell sitting beside her bed, the elderly housekeeper's gnarled hands busy with knitting needles that clicked softly in the quiet room. "The baby?" the woman asked immediately, her throat dry and scratchy. Martha set aside her knitting. "Still in surgery. It's been 4 hours now." She poured a cup of water from the bedside pitcher and offered it to the woman, who took it gratefully. "You called me Rose yesterday," the woman said after drinking. "Who is she?" Martha's hands trembled slightly as she resumed her knitting. "She was Mrs. Monroe's dearest friend. They grew up together in Bainbridge Island, went to the same schools, even attended the same college. Rose was vibrant, always laughing, always with some new adventure planned. The opposite of Margaret, who was quiet and proper, but they balanced each other." "What happened to her?" "She disappeared," Martha said, her needles pausing momentarily. "About 2 weeks before little Caleb was taken. There was a terrible fight between her and Margaret. I never knew what it was about, but I heard the shouting. The next day, Rose was gone. Margaret said she'd moved to Australia suddenly, but—" Martha shook her head. It never felt right. The woman closed her eyes, trying to capture the wisps of memory that danced at the edges of her consciousness. "I know her," she whispered. "Somehow, I know her." Before Martha could respond, the door opened and Edward entered, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with cautious hope. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "The baby's heart is beating stronger already. Dr. Chen believes he has an excellent chance at a full recovery." The woman exhaled sharply, her body sagging with relief. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Edward with genuine gratitude. "I don't know why you're helping us, but thank you." Edward didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down, his movements deliberate, as if he were gathering his courage. "The baby's blood type is very rare," he said finally. "It's the same as Caleb's, the same as mine, and preliminary DNA tests show markers consistent with the Monroe bloodline." Martha gasped softly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. "What does that mean?" the woman asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew, or at least suspected, the answer. "It means," Edward said carefully, "that this baby is almost certainly related to me, genetically, by blood." The implications hung heavy in the air. If the baby was a Monroe, and if this woman was indeed Rose Wilson's daughter, then— "I need to know everything," Edward continued, his voice tightly controlled. "Every fragment of memory, every dream, every fleeting impression, no matter how small or insignificant it seems." The woman nodded, her hands twisting nervously in the bedsheets. "I've been having more flashbacks since I came here, mostly about a room with dark curtains, and a voice, a woman's voice, always angry, always telling me I don't belong." Edward leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Anything else? Anything about Caleb?" She frowned in concentration. "I remember a song, a lullaby, I think, and—" She paused, her face suddenly lighting with recognition. "A blanket, a blue blanket with stars embroidered on it. I can see a little boy holding it." Martha's hands flew to her mouth. "That was Caleb's security blanket," she whispered. "He wouldn't go anywhere without it. Not even the blanket was found when he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Edward stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "I need to make some calls. There's someone else who needs to see you, someone who might help us piece this together." As he reached the door, the woman called out, "Mr. Monroe?" He turned back. "The baby needs a name," she said softly, "for the hospital records, if nothing else." Edward hesitated, years of pain and hope warring in his expression. "What would you like to call him?" She smiled faintly, the first genuine smile either of them had seen from her. "Samuel. I don't know why, but that name feels right." "Samuel," Edward repeated, testing the name. "Sam." He nodded once, sharply, then left. In the corridor, he nearly collided with a young doctor he didn't recognize. A man in his early 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a slightly too eager expression. "Mr. Monroe?" "I'm Dr. Reeves," the man said, extending his hand. "I've been assigned to your grandson's post-operative care." Edward shook the offered hand automatically, then froze. "I never said he was my grandson." Dr. Reeves blinked rapidly. "I just assumed, given the circumstances." "Who are you really?" Edward demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And who sent you?" The man's expression shifted, the eager helpfulness replaced by something colder, more calculating. Without another word, he turned and walked swiftly toward the elevator. Edward watched him go, a chill spreading through his chest. He pulled out his phone and dialed security, but he already knew the imposter would be gone before they could apprehend him. Someone was watching, someone knew. Back in her room, the woman had fallen into an uneasy sleep once more. As she dreamed, her hand moved to the small table beside her bed, unconsciously seeking the comfort of the baby formula can with its taped photograph. Her fingers brushed against something else instead, a small cloth bundle that Martha had left behind. She opened her eyes to find she was holding a child's handkerchief, yellowed with age. In one corner, embroidered in delicate blue thread, were the initials CM, Caleb Monroe. The winding mountain road to Cascade Pines, Edward Monroe's long-abandoned country estate, snaked through towering Douglas firs that blocked out much of the February sunlight. In the back seat of Edward's black Bentley, the woman, still nameless despite giving Samuel his, gazed out at the passing wilderness, her reflection ghost-like against the dark glass. The baby, securely nestled in a state-of-the-art car seat beside her, slept peacefully, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm that had been absent before the surgery. It had been Dr. Abernathy's suggestion to move them from the clinic. That false doctor was just the beginning, he'd warned Edward. They'll try again, and next time they might succeed. Security at Lakeside had been compromised, but Monroe's country estate, untouched for over a decade and known to only a handful of people, offered a safer haven. And perhaps, Edward hoped, a trigger for more of the woman's buried memories. The car rounded a final bend, and the estate came into view, a sprawling Pacific Northwest interpretation of a French chateau, its stone facade partially reclaimed by creeping ivy, its once manicured gardens now wild and overgrown. Tall windows reflected the cloudy sky like blind eyes staring out at the surrounding forest. "What is this place?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward, sitting in the front passenger seat, while his most trusted security officer drove, didn't immediately answer. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest. He hadn't been back here since Margaret's funeral. Couldn't bear to see the rooms where they had once been happy, the gardens where Caleb had played, the lake where they'd taught him to swim. "It was our summer home," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Before." The massive oak front door groaned in protest as Edward pushed it open, releasing the musty scent of neglected grandeur. Dust covers draped the furniture like shrouds, and cobwebs adorned the crystal chandeliers. Despite Martha's insistence that she'd had a cleaning service maintain the place over the years, it was clear no one had truly lived here for a very long time. "The electricity and water should be working," Edward said as they stepped into the cavernous foyer. "Martha arranged for everything to be turned on yesterday." He led them through the house, each room a museum of suspended grief. The woman carried Samuel against her shoulder, the baby's eyes wide as he took in the new surroundings. She moved cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the heavy silence that blanketed the estate. "This way," Edward said, pausing before a set of double doors at the end of the main hallway. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, then pushed them open. The library beyond was a soaring two-story space, its walls lined with bookshelves that reached toward the coffered ceiling. A spiral staircase in one corner led to a second-level gallery. But it was what stood in the center of the room that caused the woman to stop abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. A grand piano, its once gleaming red lacquer, finished now dulled with age and neglect. "The red piano," she whispered, her free hand moving to her temple as if in pain. "I remember this." Edward's heart raced. "What do you remember?" She approached the instrument slowly, almost reverently. Someone was playing a lullaby. She hummed a few tentative notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. The tune was so sad, but so beautiful. Edward felt the blood drain from his face. The melody she was humming, it was the song Margaret had composed for Caleb, a lullaby she'd played for him every night before bed. "Try," he urged, gesturing toward the piano bench. "See if your hands remember what your mind doesn't." Carefully, she placed Samuel on a dusty velvet love seat, surrounding him with cushions to prevent him from rolling. Then, with visible trepidation, she sat at the piano, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the yellowed ivory keys. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as if guided by some force beyond conscious memory, her fingers descended, striking a simple, haunting chord, and another, and another. The melody that filled the library was halting at first, punctuated by wrong notes and hesitations, but gradually it found its rhythm. The same lullaby she had hummed, but fuller, richer, imbued with an emotional depth that brought stinging tears to Edward's eyes. It was Margaret's lullaby for Caleb, note for perfect note. Edward sank heavily into a nearby chair, his legs no longer able to support him. The woman played on, her eyes closed now, her body swaying gently with the music, lost in whatever fragmented memories the melody had unlocked. When the final notes faded into silence, she opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I know this song," she said. "I know it in my bones." "My wife composed it," Edward said, his voice barely audible, "for our son. She never wrote it down, never had to. She played it from memory, every night." The woman's hands trembled on the keys. "Then how do I know it?" Before Edward could respond, Samuel began to fuss on the love seat. The woman immediately went to him, lifting him into her arms with the instinctive grace of a mother who, despite her amnesia, remembered the most fundamental aspects of caregiving. "He's hungry," she said. "Is there somewhere I can prepare his formula?" Edward nodded, grateful for the mundane interruption that allowed him to collect himself. "The kitchen should be stocked. I had Martha arrange for supplies." While she fed the baby, Edward wandered the library, running his fingers along dust-covered bookshelves, each volume a memory of the life that had been ripped away from him. On an end table near the piano, a silver-framed photograph caught his eye, one that had somehow escaped being packed away with the other family mementos after Margaret's death. It showed the three of them, Edward, Margaret, and Caleb, on the dock by the lake, their faces sun-kissed and laughing. Caleb couldn't have been more than 7 in the photo, his front tooth missing, his mop of dark hair wind-blown. Edward picked up the frame, wiping away the dust with his sleeve. Looking at Caleb's face, he could see what Martha and Dr. Abernathy had been too kind to point out. Samuel looked eerily like his missing son. The same cowlick at the crown, the same slightly pointed ears, the same determined set to his tiny jaw. "Mr. Monroe?" The woman's voice startled him from his reverie. She stood in the doorway, Samuel nestled against her shoulder, her expression troubled. "There's something I need to show you." She led him back to the piano, gesturing for him to move it away from the wall. Puzzled but curious, Edward complied, pushing the heavy instrument forward a few feet. "Behind it," she said. "There's something there." Edward crouched down, peering into the shadowy space between the piano and the wall. At first, he saw nothing. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he spotted it. A small, tarnished silver box, pushed far back against the baseboard. His hands shaking, he retrieved the box and placed it on the piano's dusty surface. It was a music box, ornately decorated with flowers and birds in relief. "Open it," the woman whispered, her eyes fixed on the object as if it might disappear if she looked away. Edward carefully lifted the lid. Immediately, a tinkling melody began to play, the same lullaby the woman had just performed, but in the simplified form of a music box tune. Nestled inside, on a bed of faded velvet, was an old cassette tape. Written on the label in Margaret's elegant handwriting were the words, "For Rose and Caleb, with eternal love." The woman stared at the tape, her breathing shallow and rapid. I know this music box." Her voice broke. "It was mine." Edward's world tilted on its axis. The implications were staggering, too enormous to fully comprehend. If the music box had been given to Rose and Caleb together, "We need to find a cassette player," he said, his voice strangely calm despite the tempest of emotions raging inside him. Now, after 20 minutes of searching through storage closets, they found an old boombox in what had once been the staff quarters. Edward's hands trembled so badly that the woman had to insert the tape and press play. The sound quality was poor, degraded by years of neglect, but the voice that emerged from the speakers was unmistakably Margaret's, younger, softer, without the brittle edge it had acquired in later years. "My dearest Rose," Margaret's recorded voice began, "if you're listening to this, it means I've finally found the courage to tell Edward the truth. About us, about Caleb, about everything. I can't live with this secret anymore, this terrible—" The tape cut off abruptly, the remainder nothing but electronic hiss. Edward and the woman stared at the cassette player in stunned silence, the implications of those few sentences hanging heavy in the air between them. "What was she going to tell you?" the woman finally asked. Edward shook his head slowly, his mind racing through possibilities, each more devastating than the last. "I don't know," he said hoarsely. "Margaret never told me anything about her and Rose being more than friends." The woman cradled Samuel closer, as if to protect him from the revelations unfolding around them. "She called me Rose's daughter," she said softly. "But that doesn't explain how I know the lullaby. How I knew exactly where to find the music box." Edward's gaze returned to the cassette player, his expression hardening with sudden resolve. "There's someone who might know," he said. "Someone who's been here since the beginning." As if summoned by his words, the crunch of tires on gravel announced a vehicle approaching the house. Through the library windows, they could see Martha Campbell emerging from a taxi, her stooped figure moving slowly toward the front entrance. But there was someone else with her, a weathered elderly man whose gnarled hands clutched a worn leather satchel. Even from a distance, Edward recognized him. Joseph Miller, the estate's former groundskeeper, the man who had helped him search every inch of the property after Caleb vanished. The man who had found Margaret's body in the lake. Joseph Miller's weathered face had deepened into a topography of wrinkles since Edward had last seen him. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that missed nothing, remained unchanged. He stood in the library doorway, leaning heavily on a hand-carved walking stick, his expression a careful mask that gave nothing away. "Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice like gravel underfoot. "Been a long time." Edward nodded stiffly. The last time he'd seen Joseph had been at Margaret's funeral, where the old groundskeeper had stood apart from the other mourners, his face etched with something darker than grief, something that in retrospect had looked unsettlingly like guilt. "Martha said you needed to see me," Joseph continued, his gaze shifting to the woman who stood by the piano, Samuel cradled against her chest. The old man's eyes widened slightly, a subtle tell that didn't escape Edward's notice. "You recognize her," Edward said. It wasn't a question. Joseph's gnarled fingers tightened around his walking stick. "She looks like Rose," he said simply. "But you already knew that." The woman stepped forward, her eyes searching Joseph's face. "Did you know her, Rose?" A shadow passed over Joseph's features. "I knew everyone who came and went from this place for 40 years, miss. I was here when Mrs. Monroe brought Rose home from college for the first time. I was here when little Caleb was born, and I was here when—" He trailed off, his eyes dropping to the floor. "When what, Joseph?" Edward pressed, moving closer to the old man. Martha intervened, placing a protective hand on Joseph's arm. "He's brought something for you, Mr. Monroe, something important." Joseph nodded, slowly lowering himself onto a dusty armchair. From the leather satchel he carried, he withdrew a book bound in faded red cloth, a diary, its spine cracked with age, its pages yellowed. "Found this after Mrs. Monroe passed," he said, his voice rougher now. "It was in the boathouse, hidden under a loose floorboard. I should have given it to you then, but—" He shook his head. "I read it, and after I did, I thought maybe some truths were better left buried." Edward took the diary with trembling hands. "This is Margaret's." "Yes, sir. Her last one, I reckon. Dates from about 3 months before little Caleb disappeared." Edward stared at the diary, both desperate to know its contents and terrified of what he might find. The woman moved closer to him, her presence somehow steadying despite the turmoil that surrounded them both. "I'll take Samuel for a walk," Martha said quietly. "Give you some privacy to read." After Martha had left with the baby, Edward sank onto the piano bench, the diary heavy in his hands. Joseph remained seated, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes watchful. "You should read it out loud," the woman suggested softly. "Maybe hearing the words will help me remember." Edward nodded, taking a deep breath before opening to the first entry. The handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's, elegant yet somehow brittle, the pen pressing deeply into the paper as if each word had cost her great effort. "April 3rd, 1999, he began. "Rose came back today. After all this time, all these years of silence, she just appeared at the door as if no time had passed. Edward was in New York for business, thank God. I don't know what I would have done if he'd been here to see her, to see the way she looked at me, to see the way I must have looked at her." Edward paused, his brow furrowed. "I don't remember Rose visiting then. I was in New York that week for a merger deal, but Margaret never mentioned Rose coming by." Joseph shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Keep reading, sir." Edward turned the page. "April 10th, 1999. Rose is staying at the Clayton Motel in town. She comes every day while Edward is at work, while Caleb is at school. We talk for hours, like we used to. Sometimes I forget all that happened between us. Sometimes I forget how badly I hurt her. But then she'll look at me with such sorrow, and it all comes flooding back." The woman closed her eyes, her fingers pressing against her temples. "I can almost see her," she whispered. "Red hair, always laughing." Edward continued reading, his voice growing more strained with each entry. Margaret described clandestine meetings with Rose, conversations that seemed to dance around some shared secret, some past transgression that Margaret could not bring herself to name explicitly. Then came the entry that made Edward's blood run cold. May 2nd, 1999. Rose brought photographs today of her daughter. The girl looked so much like her, the same eyes, the same smile. She's beautiful. Rose named her Emma. Emma is 9 now, the same age as Caleb. I wanted to be sick when I saw her. Not because of the girl herself, but because of what she represents. The truth I've been running from for 10 years. "Emma?" the woman breathed, the name hanging in the air like a revelation. "My name is Emma." Edward could barely continue, his hands shaking so badly that the diary's pages rustled. The next entries described a growing tension between Margaret and Rose, arguments about what Rose called setting things right, and what Margaret called destroying everything. And then, the entry that changed everything. June 1st, 1999. Rose knows. She found the letters I'd hidden in the attic, the ones that prove everything. She confronted me today, said she's going to tell Edward the truth, that I've been unfaithful. Not with another man, as he might have feared, but with her, Rose. My Rose. For years, even after I married Edward, she's going to tell him that Caleb... Edward stopped, the words before him too devastating to speak aloud. What? The woman, Emma, urged. What was she going to tell you about Caleb? Edward forced himself to continue, his voice barely audible. She's going to tell him that Caleb isn't his son, that I was already pregnant with Rose's brother's child when I married Edward, that I've been lying to everyone for a decade. The silence that followed was deafening. Joseph stared at his gnarled hands, while Emma stood frozen by the piano, her face a mask of shock. I don't understand, Edward finally said, his voice hollow. Margaret and I tried for years to have a child before Caleb. The doctors told us it was unlikely. When she finally got pregnant, it was a miracle. Not a miracle, Joseph said quietly. A lie. Edward flipped through the remaining pages, reading frantically now. The entries grew increasingly erratic. Margaret describing paranoia, insomnia, a growing fear that Rose would destroy her perfect life. June 15th, 1999. I did something terrible today, something unforgivable. Rose came to the house, said she couldn't wait any longer, that Edward deserved to know the truth. She brought Emma with her. The girl looked so much like Caleb. Anyone who saw them together would know they're related. I panicked. I told Rose to leave, to take her bastard child, and never come back. I said things, horrible things. Emma was crying, Rose was shouting, and then the next page had been torn out. Edward frantically flipped forward, finding only one final entry, dated 2 days before Caleb's disappearance. What I've done can never be undone. God forgive me. Edward never will. The diary ended there, the remaining pages blank. Edward closed it slowly, feeling as if he had just read the script for a tragedy he'd been unwittingly acting in for 25 years. What happened after that fight? He asked Joseph, his voice dangerously quiet. What did she do? The old groundskeeper shook his head. I don't know for certain. I was working by the lake that day. I heard shouting from the house, saw Rose leaving in a hurry with a little girl. They drove off and I didn't think much of it at the time. He paused, his face troubled. But 2 weeks later, when Caleb went missing, you suspected something. Emma finished for him, her voice hollow with realization. Joseph nodded slowly. Mrs. Monroe. She changed after that fight with Rose, became paranoid, kept Caleb close, wouldn't let him out of her sight, except that one day, the day he disappeared. She was supposed to be watching him while he played by the lake, but when I walked past, she was just sitting there, staring out at the water, and Caleb was gone. Edward felt the world tilting beneath him. For 25 years, he had believed his son had been abducted by a stranger, that Margaret's suicide had been the result of unbearable grief and guilt at having momentarily looked away. But now, there's one more thing, Joseph said, reaching again into his satchel. The last page of the diary. I tore it out back then. Thought it was better that way. But you deserve to know everything now. He handed Edward a folded yellowed page. With trembling fingers, Edward opened it and read the final entry in his wife's diary. Rose called yesterday. She and Emma are leaving Seattle forever. She says they're going somewhere I'll never find them. She's taking Caleb with them. Emma gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. She knew. Rose knew where Caleb was. Edward looked up at Joseph, his face ashen. Did Margaret take Caleb? Did she hurt him? The old man's eyes filled with tears. I don't know, sir, that's God's truth. But the day after Caleb disappeared, I found Mrs. Monroe burning clothes in the garden incinerator. A child's clothes. The horror of that statement hung in the air, suffocating them all. Edward felt his chest constricting, his vision narrowing to a pinpoint. The possibility that Margaret, his Margaret, could have harmed their son, all to keep her secret. No, Emma said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been before. No, Caleb wasn't hurt. I know it. Edward looked at her, desperate to believe. How can you be sure? Because, she said, her eyes clear with certainty, I remember him. Not just from photographs. I remember playing with him, here, in this house, and later, Somewhere else, somewhere with mountains and snow. Montana, Joseph murmured. Rose had family in Montana. Emma nodded eagerly. Yes, a cabin with a blue door. Caleb and I, we were there together. We were safe. Hope bloomed in Edward's chest, fragile but persistent. If Caleb is alive, if Rose took him somewhere safe, then Samuel is Caleb's son, Emma finished. Your grandson. The revelation settled over them like a blanket, heavy with implications, but also strangely with comfort. Whatever the truth of the past, Samuel was family, blood of his blood. As the afternoon light slanted through the library windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor, Edward made a decision. He would find the truth, all of it, no matter how painful, no matter what it revealed about Margaret, about Rose, about the son he had mourned for 25 years, and he would start in Montana. The attic of the Cascade Pines estate was a museum of forgotten memories, preserved under dust covers and layers of neglect. Edward had not ventured up here since before Caleb's disappearance, and each step on the creaking wooden stairs felt like a journey through time. The sharp, musty scent of mothballs and old paper assaulted his senses as he pushed open the heavy trapdoor, revealing a vast space beneath the eaves of the mansion. Behind him, Emma followed cautiously, her hand gripping the railing for support. Samuel had been left in Martha's care downstairs, allowing them to focus on their search for answers without distraction. Joseph had drawn them a crude map of the attic, marking an area where Margaret had kept her most private possessions, a section he had been expressly forbidden to disturb during his decades of service. "Over there," Edward said, directing the beam of his flashlight toward a cluster of trunks arranged beneath a dormer window. The late afternoon sunlight filtering through the dirty glass cast an eerie amber glow over the scene, illuminating dust motes that swirled like constellations in the air. Emma moved toward the trunks, kneeling before the largest one, an ornate cedar chest with brass fittings that had been her mother's. Edward watched as she ran her fingers lightly over the carved lid, her expression a mixture of trepidation and determination. "It's locked," she said, tugging at the clasp. Edward knelt beside her, producing a ring of keys from his pocket. "Joseph gave me these, said they were to Margaret's private things." The third key turned smoothly in the lock, and the chest opened with a soft groan of protest. Inside lay neatly folded linens, christening gowns, baby blankets, mementos of Caleb's infancy that Margaret had preserved with meticulous care. Edward lifted them out reverently, each item a bittersweet reminder of the son he had lost, or perhaps never truly had. Beneath the linens was a collection of photo albums, their leather covers cracked with age. And at the very bottom of the chest, a wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. "This," Edward said, lifting it out, his hands trembling slightly. Margaret kept her most precious things in this box. It was her grandmother's. Emma watched intently as Edward opened it, revealing a collection of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, several jewelry cases, and nestled among them what appeared to be a hollowed-out book, its pages cut away to create a hiding place. "The Great Gatsby," Emma murmured, reaching for the book. "I remember someone reading this to me." Inside the false book was a VHS tape, its label written in Margaret's elegant script. Caleb's 7th birthday, 1997. Edward stared at it, his throat constricting with emotion. "There's an old TV and VCR in the guest suite downstairs. Margaret used to watch home movies there when she couldn't sleep." Warm, the guest suite was a time capsule of late 90s luxury. A floral patterned comforter on the king-sized bed, heavy drapes framing windows that overlooked the now overgrown gardens. The television set was bulky by modern standards, but when Edward plugged it in and pressed the power button, it hummed to life. His hands shook as he inserted the tape into the VCR, the plastic casing warm from being clutched so tightly. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her posture tense with anticipation, her eyes fixed on the screen. Static crackled, then cleared to reveal the library downstairs, decorated with balloons and streamers. A banner reading "Happy Birthday, Caleb" stretched across the bookshelves. The timestamp in the corner read July 17th, 1997, exactly 2 years before Caleb would disappear forever. Edward's breath caught in his throat as the camera panned to reveal Caleb, beaming with gap-toothed delight as he unwrapped a shiny red bicycle. His dark hair fell across his forehead in the same cowlick that Samuel had, his green eyes bright with childish excitement. "That's him," Emma whispered, leaning forward. "That's how I remember him." The scene shifted to show other children arriving for the party, and then Edward felt his heart stop. A little girl with copper hair, wearing a blue dress with white polka dots. She couldn't have been more than 7, the same age as Caleb, but there was something in her posture, in the serious set of her mouth, that was unmistakably familiar. "It's you," Edward said, his voice barely audible above the children's laughter from the television. Emma stared at her younger self, transfixed. The camera followed as young Emma approached Caleb shyly, offering a small wrapped package. Caleb took it eagerly, tearing away the paper to reveal a handmade bracelet of braided leather and colorful beads. "I made it," the little girl on the screen said proudly. "Mommy helped me." And then, just at the edge of the frame, a flash of red hair, a woman's hand reaching out to steady young Emma as she wobbled slightly. "Rose," Edward breathed, willing the camera to pan left, to show the face of the woman who had been Margaret's best friend, Emma's mother, and perhaps the key to Caleb's fate. But before that could happen, Margaret's voice cut sharply through the festive atmosphere. "Take that girl out of my house!" The camera jolted, swinging wildly before focusing on Margaret's face, beautiful, composed, but with a fury in her eyes that sent a chill down Edward's spine. She was looking directly at someone off camera, her expression one of cold rage. "You weren't invited," Margaret continued, her voice deadly quiet. "Neither of you were." The camera, operated by what must have been a confused party guest, continued to record as Rose finally stepped into frame. She was stunning, tall and willowy, with the same copper hair as Emma, though hers was longer, cascading down her back in loose waves. Her face was flushed with emotion, her eyes, so like Emma's, bright with unshed tears. "Caleb invited us," Rose said, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from her. "He and Emma are friends. You can't keep them apart forever, Maggie." "Don't call me that," Margaret hissed. "You lost that right a long time ago." The two women stared at each other across the festive room, years of complicated history crackling between them like electricity. Young Caleb and Emma stood frozen, their faces mirrors of confusion and fear. "They're cousins," Rose said, her voice dropping to a whisper that the microphone barely caught. "Blood, family. You can't erase that, no matter how hard you try." Margaret's face contorted with rage. "Get out! Take that girl with you and get out of my house!" The screen suddenly went black, the recording abruptly cut off. Edward and Emma sat in stunned silence, the implications of what they had just witnessed hanging heavy in the air between them. "Cousins?" Emma finally said, her voice hollow with shock. "Rose called Caleb and me cousins. If Rose's brother was Caleb's biological father," Edward said slowly, "that would make you and Caleb cousins." He ran a trembling hand through his silver hair. But who was he? Margaret's diary never mentioned his name. Emma closed her eyes, her face contorting with the effort of retrieving buried memories. "There was a man who visited sometimes, at the cabin in Montana. Caleb called him Uncle James." "James Wilson," Edward breathed, the name triggering a distant recollection. Rose's older brother. He was a graduate student at the same university Margaret attended. "I met him once, at our wedding. He seemed uncomfortable." "Nit?" The tape had begun to automatically rewind, the mechanical whirring filling the silence as they each processed this new piece of the puzzle. When it clicked to a stop, Emma reached out and pressed play again, as if hoping to extract some new detail from the footage. The birthday party reappeared on screen, but something was different. This was later in the day after the confrontation. The children were gone, the decorations partially dismantled. The camera had been left running, forgotten in the chaos. It showed Caleb, sitting alone on the piano bench, turning the leather bracelet from Emma over and over in his small hands. Margaret entered the frame, kneeling before her son with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Forget about that girl, sweetheart," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "She won't be coming back." Caleb looked up, his expression serious beyond his years. "She's my friend, Mommy." "And Uncle James said—" Margaret's hand shot out, gripping Caleb's arm with enough force to make him wince. "Don't ever mention that name in this house. Do you understand me? That man is nothing to you. Nothing." The raw fear on Caleb's face as he nodded made Edward's stomach clench with a mixture of horror and rage. This was a side of Margaret he had never seen, or perhaps had chosen not to see. The screen went black again, this time for good. Edward ejected the tape with numb fingers, his world tilting on its axis. Everything he had believed about his wife, his marriage, his son, all of it built on lies. Emma's face had gone pale, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. "She was hurting him," she whispered. "Not physically, maybe, but—" She trailed off, her eyes haunted. "What happened after the party?" Edward asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Do you remember?" Emma pressed her palms against her temples, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We left Seattle. Mom was crying. We drove for a long time. And then—" She gasped, her eyes flying open. "The accident. There was a car accident." Edward leaned forward. "What accident? When?" "A few weeks after the party. We were on our way to Montana. A truck hit our car. Mom was hurt badly. I hit my head." Her hand unconsciously traced the scar on her jawline. "After that, everything gets foggy. But I remember Caleb being there, in Montana. I remember playing with him in the snow." A piece clicked into place in Edward's mind. "The accident must be what gave you amnesia. Not recently, but back then when you were a child. And later, whatever happened to you months ago triggered those buried memories." Emma nodded slowly, then froze, her expression suddenly alert. "Wait, there's something else in the tape case." Edward looked down at the plastic VHS case in his hands. Sure enough, tucked into the inner sleeve was a folded piece of paper. He carefully extracted it and opened it to reveal a child's drawing. A crayon illustration of two stick figures holding hands, standing in front of what appeared to be a cabin with a blue door. The taller figure had red scribbles for hair, the smaller one dark brown. In a child's uneven lettering across the top were the words, "Emma and Caleb at the safe place." At the bottom, in adult handwriting, was an address in Whitefish, Montana. Edward stared at the paper, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is it," he said, his voice tight with a hope he hardly dared to feel. "This is where Rose took Caleb, where she raised him." Emma took the drawing from him, her fingers tracing the childish figures with tender recognition. "We were happy there," she said softly. "I remember that much. We were safe. But something happened," Edward pressed. "Something that separated you from Rose, from Caleb." Before Emma could respond, a sharp cry echoed through the baby monitor they had brought upstairs. Samuel had awakened from his nap. Emma rose immediately, her maternal instincts overriding all else. "I'll check on him," she said, moving toward the door. She paused in the doorway, turning back to Edward with an expression of sudden clarity. "Mr. Monroe, I think Caleb is alive. I think he's looking for me." "Did he?" As she disappeared down the hallway, Edward remained seated on the edge of the bed, the empty tape case still in his hands. The possibility that his son, or rather, the boy he had raised as his son, might still be alive after all these years, was almost too overwhelming to comprehend. And if Caleb was alive, if he had been raised by Rose in that cabin in Montana, then that meant— Edward's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps hurrying back up the stairs, not Emma's light tread, but Martha's more substantial gait. "Mr. Monroe!" she called, her voice tight with alarm. "Come quickly! There's someone at the gate." A man! He's demanding to see Emma and the baby. Edward rushed to the window, peering through the dusty glass toward the estate's entrance. In the fading evening light, he could make out a figure at the wrought iron gates, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the last rays of the setting sun. Even from this distance, even after 25 years, Edward recognized the set of those shoulders, the stance that mirrored his own. Caleb had come home. The long gravel driveway of the Cascade Pines estate had never seemed so endless. Edward Munro stood frozen at the top of the grand staircase, watching through the beveled glass of the front door as the security guard escorted the visitor toward the house. Each step the man took sent a tremor through Edward's body, a physical manifestation of the earthquake reshaping his world. It was Caleb. It couldn't be anyone else. Even from this distance, Edward could see Margaret's chin, James Wilson's height, and most painful of all, hints of his own mannerisms in the way the man carried himself. Nature and nurture, blood and upbringing, all tangled together in this person who was both stranger and son. Behind Edward, Emma descended the stairs with Samuel in her arms. The baby had been changed and fed, his tiny face peaceful in sleep, unaware of the momentous reunion about to take place. Emma's expression, however, was anything but peaceful. Her eyes were wide, with a mixture of hope and terror, her breathing shallow and quick. "Is it him?" she whispered, coming to stand beside Edward. "Is it Caleb?" Before Edward could answer, Martha bustled into the foyer, wringing her hands anxiously. "Mr. Munro, shall I let him in? The young man is quite insistent." Edward nodded, unable to form words. His throat felt constricted, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. For 25 years, he had dreamed of this moment, had imagined finding Caleb alive, bringing him home, reclaiming the years that had been stolen. But now that it was happening, he felt only a terrible vulnerability, as if his skin had been stripped away, leaving every nerve exposed. The heavy front door swung open, and there he was. Caleb Munro, or rather, the man who had once been Caleb Munro, stood in the entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading evening light. At 34, he bore only a ghostly resemblance to the 9-year-old boy Edward had lost. His dark hair was cut short, his jawline strong beneath a few days' stubble. His eyes, those unmistakable green eyes, shadowed with exhaustion and something harder to define. For a long moment no one spoke. The air in the foyer seemed to crystallize around them, suspending them in a tableau of stunned recognition. Then Samuel stirred in Emma's arms, making a soft cooing sound, and the spell was broken. "Emma," Caleb said, his voice deeper than Edward had imagined it would be. His eyes were fixed on her face, drinking in every detail as if to assure himself she was real. "I've been searching for you for months." Emma took a hesitant step forward, her body swaying slightly as if caught in a current. "Caleb?" she whispered, the name both a question and a recognition. "Is it really you?" A complex emotion passed over Caleb's face. Relief, tenderness, and something like guilt. "It's me, Em. I'm sorry it took so long to find you." His gaze shifted to the bundle in her arms, and his expression softened further. "Is that your son?" Emma confirmed, her voice steadier now. "Samuel." Caleb moved forward, his steps measured and careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. When he reached Emma, he tentatively extended a hand to touch Samuel's cheek with a gentleness that made Edward's heart constrict. "He has your eyes," Emma said softly. "I knew it from the moment he was born." Only then did Caleb seem to register Edward's presence. He looked up, and for the first time in 25 years, father and son, or what had been father and son, faced each other. "Mr. Munro," Caleb said, his voice formal, guarded. There was no dad, no rush of emotion, just a careful acknowledgement that revealed nothing of what he might be feeling. Edward found his voice at last, though it emerged rough with suppressed emotion. "You've been alive all this time." It wasn't a question, but Caleb nodded anyway. "Rose took me to Montana after—" He hesitated. his jaw tightening. After what happened with Margaret. What did happen? Edward asked, the question that had haunted him for a quarter-century finally given voice. The truth, Caleb. All of it. Caleb's eyes darted to Martha and the security guard, who lingered uncertainly by the door. Perhaps somewhere more private? They retreated to the library, the scene of so many revelations already. Martha brought tea that no one touched, then discreetly withdrew, closing the doors behind her. Caleb stood by the red piano, his fingers lightly tracing its dusty surface in a gesture so familiar that Edward felt physical pain watching it. Rose wasn't just Margaret's friend, Caleb began, his voice steady and measured, as if he had rehearsed this explanation many times. They were lovers, from college until shortly after Margaret met you. When Margaret ended things to marry you, Rose was devastated. She moved away, tried to start over. He paused, gathering his thoughts. What Margaret didn't know was that she was already pregnant when she married you, with James Wilson's child, Rose's brother. It had been a one-time thing, a mistake, during a period when she and Rose were briefly separated. She never told James, never told anyone. Edward sank heavily onto a chair, the confirmation of what Margaret's diary had suggested hitting him with physical force. She let me believe you were mine. For 9 years. Caleb nodded, his expression carefully neutral. Rose figured it out when I was 7. The timing, certain hereditary traits that run in the Wilson family. She confronted Margaret, who initially denied everything. But Rose was persistent. She wanted Margaret to tell you the truth. The confrontation at your birthday party, Emma interjected, bouncing Samuel gently as he began to fuss. I remember that now. Yes, Caleb confirmed. After that, things escalated. Margaret became increasingly unstable. She was drinking heavily, taking pills. She would alternate between tearful apologies and terrifying rages. His voice grew softer, tinged with old pain. She started telling me terrible things about Rose, about Emma. That they wanted to take me away, that they would hurt me. Edward closed his eyes, a wave of guilt washing over him. How had he not seen what was happening in his own home? How had he been so blind to Margaret's deterioration, to Caleb's fear? The night I disappeared, Caleb continued, Margaret had been drinking. She told me we were going on a trip, just the two of us. But she was driving erratically, crying 1 minute and screaming the next. I was terrified. He swallowed hard, the memory clearly still difficult. She drove to the lake, not here, but a smaller one about 20 miles east. She parked and told me we were going swimming. It was June, but the water was still freezing. When I refused to get out of the car, He paused, struggling. She said if she couldn't have me, no one would. Emma gasped, clutching Samuel closer. Edward felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. The implication of what Margaret had intended was too horrible to contemplate. Rose found us, Caleb said, his voice steadier now. She'd been following Margaret for days, worried about her state of mind. She confronted her at the lake and there was a struggle. Margaret fell and hit her head on a rock. She wasn't badly hurt, but she was dazed. Rose grabbed me and we ran. She kidnapped you, Edward said, the words hollow. She saved me, Caleb corrected, a flash of steel in his voice. Margaret was going to drown us both. I heard her say it. Rose took me to Montana, to her family's cabin. We lived there under different names. She homeschooled me. We were happy. The simplicity of that statement hung in the air, a stark counterpoint to the decades of grief and searching that had consumed Edward's life. And Emma? Edward asked, turning to the young woman who sat watching Caleb with a mixture of wonder and confusion. How does she fit into all this? Caleb's expression softened as he looked at Emma. Rose adopted Emma when she was a baby. Her birth mother was Rose's cousin, who died in childbirth. We grew up as siblings, essentially. After the accident, the one Emma mentioned, she struggled with memory issues. The doctors said it might be temporary, but he shrugged. Some things never came back. What happened to Rose? Edward asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Caleb's face darkened with grief. There was a fire at the cabin 10 years ago. Rose didn't make it out. He took a deep, steadying breath. Emma and I were both away at college. After the funeral, we kind of drifted apart. I went to medical school in Chicago. Emma moved to Portland, got married. Emma looked up sharply at this, her brow furrowed. I was married to David Jenkins, Caleb confirmed gently. For 3 years, he wasn't kind to you. When you finally left him, you were pregnant with Samuel. You called me, said you were coming to Seattle to find help. But by the time I arrived, you disappeared. The second memory loss, Edward murmured. What happened to you, Emma? Emma shook her head, frustrated. I still don't remember. Just flashes. A dark room, someone pulling my hair, feeling trapped. David, Caleb said grimly. He followed you to Seattle. The police found evidence that he held you captive in an abandoned building for several months. When they closed in, he fled, leaving you behind. You were suffering from severe malnutrition and a head injury that triggered the amnesia. The police had been looking for you, Edward said, pieces falling into place. That's who you were running from when the social worker found you. Emma nodded slowly. I thought whoever had hurt me was still after me. That they wanted to hurt Samuel. She looked at Caleb, her eyes filling with tears. I remembered the formula can. Rose gave it to me before she died. Said if I was ever in trouble to find the boy in the photo. Me, Caleb said softly. She kept that picture of me on the formula can as a reminder of when she saved me. It was the last can from the supplies she packed when we fled Seattle. Edward stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, the forest surrounding the estate, a wall of impenetrable black. He felt a similar darkness inside himself. Not anger, not quite grief, but a profound disorientation. Everything he had believed, everything that had driven him for 25 years, had been built on a foundation of lies. Why didn't you come forward? He asked without turning around, his voice low. All these years, you knew I was searching for you. There was a long silence behind him. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. Rose made me promise not to. She was convinced Margaret would try again if she found us. And later, when I was old enough to make my own decisions, I read about the Monroe Foundation, about your searches for missing children. It seemed like you had found a way to make something positive out of what happened. He paused. I thought it might be kinder to let you remember Margaret as your loving wife, not as the woman who tried to kill your son. Edward turned slowly to face him. He wasn't my son, he said, the words like stones in his mouth. Wasn't I? Caleb asked quietly. You raised me for 9 years. You taught me to ride a bike, to swim, to play chess. You read me stories every night. Biology doesn't change that. The simplicity of this truth struck Edward like a physical blow. He'd spent 25 years searching for this boy, not because of DNA, but because of love. Because Caleb, regardless of his biological parentage, was his son in every way that mattered. I'm sorry, Edward said, his voice breaking, for not seeing what was happening, for not protecting you. Caleb crossed the room in 3 long strides and did what Edward had dreamed of for a quarter century. He embraced his father. The contact broke something open inside Edward, releasing decades of grief in a flood of silent tears. When they finally separated, Emma was standing beside them, Samuel awake and alert in her arms. The baby's green eyes, Caleb's eyes, Wilson family eyes, regarded them solemnly as if understanding the gravity of the moment. He needs his family, Emma said softly. All of us. Edward looked at the 3 of them, Caleb, Emma, Samuel, and felt something shift inside him. The foundation of lies had crumbled, yes, but something new could be built on the truth, something stronger, healthier, more real. The Monroe Foundation, he said suddenly, the idea forming as he spoke. It should be yours now, both of you. He looked from Caleb to Emma. Use it to help others who have been separated from their families, who have lost their memories, their histories. Caleb's eyes widened in surprise. "Edward, that's—" "It's right," Edward interrupted firmly. "It's time for me to step back, to let go of the past and focus on the future." His gaze settled on Samuel, who had reached out to grasp his grandfather's finger with surprising strength. His future. In the days that followed, they would begin the painstaking process of reconstructing their fractured histories, finding court records of Emma's marriage and divorce, police reports of her abduction, medical documentation of the car accident that had caused her first bout of amnesia. They would locate James Wilson, now a professor of literature at a small college in Vermont, and watch his face crumple with emotion when he learned he had a son and a grandson. They would hold a small, private memorial for Rose at the lake, acknowledging her dual role as Margaret's betrayer and Caleb's savior. But for now, in the quiet of the library where so many revelations had occurred, they simply stood together, a family bound not by the lies that had separated them, but by the truth that had finally brought them home. Emma looked down at the formula can she still carried, the faded photograph of young Caleb smiling up at her across the years. "You never forgot me," she whispered to Edward, tears streaming down her face. "You just hid me inside a can of milk." Edward placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of both regret and hope. "Memory is a place where sometimes we hide from the truth," he said softly, "but the truth always finds its way out." As if in agreement, Samuel cooed, reaching up toward the faces of his family, a family that had been shattered and scattered by lies, but that had finally found its way back to each other through the enduring power of truth. What would you do if everything you believed about your life was built on lies? Edward Monroe spent 25 years searching for a son who was never truly his, while Emma struggled to recover memories that might have been better left forgotten. Sometimes the truth doesn't set us free. It shatters our world and forces us to rebuild from the broken pieces. Yet in the end, it wasn't blood that defined this family, but the choices they made in the face of devastating revelations. Edward chose forgiveness over bitterness. Caleb chose compassion over resentment. Emma chose to embrace her fragmented past rather than run from it. And through baby Samuel, they found a new beginning, proof that even from the ashes of deception, something pure and beautiful can emerge. The formula can that brought them together represented both the worst and best of humanity, a reminder of betrayal, but also a lifeline of hope. Sometimes we hide from painful truths, tucking them away in forgotten corners of our minds or inside everyday objects. But as Edward discovered, memory is a place where sometimes we hide from the truth, but the truth always finds its way out. If this story touched your heart, please follow our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who understands that family isn't always defined by blood, but by love that perseveres through the darkest of times.